Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie Aerosmith, and I'm a professor and coordinator in the School of Music at Cambrian College in Sudbury, Ontario, Canada, where I am also the resident conductor of the Sudbury Symphony Orchestra and music director of the Sudbury Youth Orchestra. I'm very grateful indeed for the opportunity to speak briefly about what I see as an increasing need for social accountability among community orchestras, in particular, regarding the role of the music director within these organizations, who are faced with the reality that adhering to their traditional role of programmer and rehearsal/performance leader while staying above the politics, i.e. exercising their privilege, is no longer sufficient or acceptable. In the short time we have for this presentation, I thought it would be most useful to share some examples, conundrums really, which illustrate the challenges and highlight the need for reflection and a reevaluation of what community orchestra leadership means in this time of social awakening. But I want to start by briefly providing some context to help understand the position of community orchestras and their directors. The current reality for community orchestras in small to medium-sized urban areas of Ontario is that they have taken on many of the characteristics and practices of their professional counterparts, including activities which extend well beyond the formal performance space. These include activities commonly put under the umbrella of outreach or community impact, and are nearly always grant-driven initiatives meant to show the funders that something is happening in the community which ticks the box and therefore justifies the expense. The issue here is that outreach programming is largely designed by and around the people who deliver it, rather than in partnership with local cultural providers. For instance, the Sudbury Symphony's core string players performing string quartet repertoire. This colonial approach still persists in my region and elsewhere. Here's what we know how to do, so we're bestowing it on you, rather than we can do this much. Talk with us so that we can learn from your rich cultures and traditions and explore whether there are ways we can collaborate. One must also consider that if the motivation here is to build audiences in order to, for instance, save a struggling organization, rather than from a genuine desire to reimagine role and practice, it is still perpetuating that same colonial attitude. Further, this is artistic activity, which should fall squarely within the remit of the artistic director. However, too many conductors tend to disassociate themselves from the grunt work of community engagement, preferring to focus on concert programming instead. The reality is that in order to be impactful over the long term, the development of community partnerships requires sustained and sometimes difficult dialogue. This, in turn, requires a rethink of how community orchestra conductors are engaged, compensated, and encouraged to act in the interest of the community partner. This includes accepting and respecting the decision by potential partners to say no. But this is not an excuse to stop trying. Now, since the time that I submitted the proposal for this paper, quite a lot has happened with regard to the topic of social justice, equity, and racism in general, all of which has had an impact on the discourse across the arts sector. In the Sudbury Symphony, as with many other arts organizations, numerous individuals have expressed their desire to express solidarity and support for Black Lives Matter. But as with so many well-intentioned gestures, it has been pointed out that such a statement coming from our orchestra would ring very hollow, given that there are no persons of color in the orchestra, nor on the board of directors, and no efforts have thus far been undertaken to address that fundamental disconnect. This is also true of the Indigenous community that remains equally underrepresented. Neither has there been inclusion of music by Black composers, which is another easily addressed lapse in our efforts to become a socially aware and responsible ensemble. While it may be simple enough to develop policies or practices which aim to improve diversity and representation at an organizational level, it falls to the music director to embody those beliefs and behaviors. And beyond the obvious steps, such as engaging guest artists from communities of color or programming music by composers of diverse backgrounds, conductors must become visible and vocal comrades in arms in the struggle for equity. Often, conductors shy away from such direct action for fear of being labeled too political. After all, there are funders who may not see social justice as a priority for community orchestras. I would argue, however, that such notions are fast becoming outdated and that conductors should, indeed are increasingly expected to, take up the cause of social justice and equity in the ways that best suit their context and reflect best practices in this regard. Now, this brings me to my last conundrum. I am a white, settler, middle-class, heterosexual male in a position of authority whose training occurred mainly at elite conservatory or liberal arts institutions and is firmly rooted in Western art music. Am I really the best person to be sounding the charge for these issues in my community or on behalf of my various organizations? I have often engaged in projects which I believe lived up to the ideals of inclusivity and representation in my community. For instance, a few years ago, the Sudbury Youth Orchestra staged a performance to coincide with Canada's 150th anniversary, in which I invited guests from many of Sudbury's cultural communities, including a young Indigenous drum circle, a West African hip-hop artist, Chinese and Ukrainian dancers, etc., all of whom were happy to participate. But on reflection, I'm not sure that I did right by those communities. Was I simply perpetuating the kind of tokenism that is prevalent in the orchestral industry? Does my inclusion of land acknowledgements in my pre-concert remarks carry any value, given that the next steps have yet to be taken by the orchestra? I have to think that trying is better than not trying, but I must also be wary that my privilege doesn't cloud my judgment on these matters. I will quickly close by saying that I believe there are lessons to be learned from community music practitioners and participants in this regard, and that taking these lessons to heart can not only serve the cause of social justice, but also prompt a reimagining of the meaning of ensemble leadership for those who occupy those privileged positions. Thank you very much.